Thank you. Welcome to the Center for National Security and Cooperation. My name is Harold Trinkunas. I'm the Deputy Director. In a moment, I'll introduce our speaker, Professor Dean Winslow. But first of all, I just want to say that it's a pleasure to be able to resume our director seminars after a break of perhaps a few months. And we're very much looking forward to the topic of today's conversation, from Bagram Airfield to Baghdad and back again, a U.S. military doctor's experience in two wars. Professor Winslow is the professor of medicine at Stanford University with appointments in the divisions of hospital medicine and infectious diseases. He is also a senior fellow by courtesy at the Friedman Spogli Institute and core faculty member here at the center since last year. We're thrilled to welcome him to CSAC. He's had a long and storied career, I have to say. I went through it all. It would be here for about 10 minutes. But I would recommend that you look at his career, which highlights a number of factors that are especially relevant to today's talk. Not only is he an academic and scholar, but he's also somebody with experience in the private sector, nonprofit medicine and healthcare. Also somebody who has a number of ties to government, both in his capacity as a doctor, but also someone who served in the U.S. Air Force and Air National Guard from 1980 to 2015, retiring as a colonel. He was a flight surgeon during that time. He deployed twice to Afghanistan and 4 times to Iraq, supporting combat operations there. And he has over 150 military flying hours, including 263 combat sorties. So someone with extensive experience in the medical sector, the academic sector, the government sector, and the military. And we're hoping he will speak to us today at the intersection of all those different aspects of his experience. Welcome, Steve.
Good. Thank you so much, Harold. It's lovely introduction. So I thought maybe since we got kind of a small, exclusive crowd, I should say today, would it be okay, Harold, if we just went around the room and everyone introduced themselves? Or would,
Sure.
Yeah, because the talk isn't that long. So good, Harold. Again, for the people that may not know you. So.
I think let's
Yeah.
just.
Yeah. Okay. Great.
Of Ross Schachter, Management Science and Engineering.
I think you know me. I'm his wife, Julie Parsonet.
Professor of Medicine. Yeah.
Herb Lid and CSAC.
Diana Zawatsky, Stanford undergraduate, prosperous perspectives computer science major.
I'm Helena Gaetawin Hawkins. I'm a freshman.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear you.
I'm Helena Gaetawin Hawkins. I'm a freshman.
Fantastic. Good.
I'm Eva Sines. I'm also an undergraduate freshman.
I'm Matthew Lau, and I'm also a frosh.
I'm Adam Zhao. I'm a freshman.
I'm Ryder Matheny. I'm also a freshman.
I'm Susan Benitez, and I'm also a freshman.
Rod Ewing. I'm a co-director here at CSAC.
Alex, freshman.
Good, good. And Kate, why don't you introduce yourself?
I'm Kate. I'm the events manager for CSAC.
Wonderful, great. Thank you so much. So I'm already wired for sound, correct, Kate? So I don't need a handheld microphone. So, first of all, I want to thank all of you for coming. I know it's a real busy time of year, particularly undergrads with exams coming up. So thank you so much. In contrast, I think most of the talks that you hear, at CSAC or FSI that are looking forward and very strategic, this, I'm going to be honest with you, is a little bit of a look backward at really kind of our last 20 years, in our long wars, as some people have called them, in Iraq and Afghanistan. Anyway, I think I'll just jump through this. Now, this is actually kind of a talk I originally put together about 5 years ago, and I've modified it, somewhat, since then. And I give this to sometimes to our medical students and residents, and particularly, before they start working at the VA. Anyway, so with no further ado, we'll go ahead and get started. So again, I think all of you that were, watching the news in late August and, were perhaps saddened, in my case, very much saddened by seeing, what happened with our chaotic withdrawal from Afghanistan. And literally within weeks after our combat forces were pulled out of Afghanistan, essentially one province after another fell, followed by the fall of Kabul to the Taliban forces in late August. A total of about 125,000 Afghans were evacuated, mostly by the United States Air Force C-17s, over a period of really like just a couple of weeks. And this was really just an amazing effort. In contrast to most what we call NEO or non-combatant emergency operations, this was, again, there was really very little time for planning. But despite that, I think it actually went off reasonably well. But it was, of course, I think, a terrible thing for people to observe, just people who were desperate. In fact, scenes like this were quite common. Again, scenes like this, and literally some people fell to their deaths as they clung to the landing gear of departing C-17s, desperate to get out, and then, of course, fell, as the aircraft climbed up into the atmosphere. This is, again, one scene. I think one aircraft, actually, this is inside of a C-17, but this set a record. I think 714, I believe, human beings were packed into this airplane, as it departed. And this is one of the last aircraft to depart Kabul airport in late August of this year. So again, as Harold very kindly said, that I did spend, I'd say, a fair amount of my adult life in Afghanistan and Iraq, and these are just some scenes. The top left is a photograph I took probably in 2011, my last deployment to Afghanistan. This is looking toward the southeast at some of the big mountains there. The scene on the upper right, I think, was late 2004 during my first full Afghanistan deployment, and the soldiers in the center are Afghan National Army soldiers that, I hope and pray are still alive, with what happened. Again, in addition to caring for soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines, we also, in both Iraq and Afghanistan, cared for a lot of host nation nationals, or Afghans or Iraqis, as the case may be. And then the picture on the lower left was actually a mission that I flew in the fall of 2004 during the lead up to the first free elections that had been held in Afghanistan for decades. And the man in the center in the robes is President Hamid Karzai, who was, again, kind of the leading candidate for president at that point. The reason that we are posing with him is that he had been criticized very heavily by our U.S. Department of State for really not leaving the capital. But the reason that he did not want to leave the capital of Kabul is that every time he did, that someone tried to kill him. And so he insisted that, that if the U.S. coalition forces wanted him to go all over Afghanistan to give speeches and show up, that he wanted to be transported by U.S. military. And he also insisted, which I thought was real interesting, that he wanted a United States Air Force flight surgeon to accompany him as well. So I rose my hand and spent a couple of days with President Karzai as he went out around the country. So people ask, well, what's a flight surgeon? And it's kind of a, if you're in the military, you have a good idea of what it is. But the way I kind of quickly explain it to people is that, we actually have a lot of roles. First of all, our main job is that we take a 12-week course at the School of Aerospace Medicine and learn a lot about aerospace medicine, which is very heavy in aerospace physiology and ophthalmology and ENT, which I just love because, as trained as an internist, like these were things that I did not get a lot of background in. And again, what your main job is that you care for crew members, so pilots, navigators, and enlisted air crew members in the United States Air Force. But also, you're expected to maintain a fair amount of emergency medicine type skills, so you're capable of deploying with combat units when they do go forward in times of war. Some of the other things that I always, and again, this is just working actually in the emergency room at our combat hospital in Baghdad. But one of the things that I really enjoyed about being a flight surgeon was the sort of ability that you could be a confidant really to the line commander, or just, the person who is actually the combatant commander of the unit. And I don't know if any of you here read any of the Patrick O'Brien books with that were written. I think you're nodding your head. I just love those. And of course, one of the most famous books, Master and Commander, was made into a movie, starring Russell Crowe as Jack Aubrey, who was the commander of this British naval vessel during the Napoleonic Wars. But to me, the part of the story that I really loved was the guy on the left, and his name was Stephen Maturin. It was the character in the book, and he was the ship surgeon. So a lot of what he did 200 years ago was kind of similar to what I did. And so often, if you remember that story, that that he and the captain would close the door in his own quarters, and they would talk about like morale issues or other things like that. And of course, as a medical corps officer, you actually a little bit are separate from officers of the line. So you actually, a good commander really encourages his doc or his doctor to talk to him about maybe what he's hearing, he or she is hearing on the ground. So anyway, I had a wonderful experience during my 35 years, as a flight surgeon, and I was very lucky in a way, in retrospect, that I never got promoted to general, because again, when you're a general, you don't get to really fly anymore or to deploy and things like that. And so those of you who are my age or older recognize this jet, the F-4 Phantom, and that was the first squadron that I was in from 1980 until actually 1995, and we flew the F-4 Phantom, which was the frontline fighter during the Vietnam War. We actually converted to the F-15 Eagle in 1985. We were the first guard or reserve unit in the world, basically, to get kind of the premier fighter, which was the F-15. But the F-4 was a lot of fun. As Harold mentioned, that I deployed well, not only the 6 times to Iraq and Afghanistan after 9/11, but also was deployed several times to Operation Provide Comfort, which was protecting the Kurds in northern Iraq, and Operation Northern Watch twice as well as various NATO exercises. So this is actually an MC-130, a combat shadow aircraft. It's a modified C-130 that was based right here at Moffett Field. So in December of 2002, they were very short of flight surgeons at the unit here. Although I wasn't assigned to that unit, I flew with them for proficiency, so they asked me to deploy. It was supposed to be a 6-week deployment, but President Bush had made the decision that we were probably going to invade, so we were all frozen in place, as they call it, and our orders were extended through May of 2003. So we were very lucky from a combat rescue standpoint that we did not lose any coalition aircraft in the northern part of Iraq, and our area of responsibility stretched from Tikrit, which is about 80 miles north of Baghdad, all the way up through Kurdistan. So again, we were very fortunate. This is Bagram Airfield, and this is a photograph I took probably in 2011. That's the old Russian control tower that was built in the 1980s, after the Soviets invaded and took over Afghanistan. And this was a photograph actually taken at Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar in late 2003. This was my second deployment in 2003. So we came home from Iraq and Romania, where we were based our combat rescue operations out of, back home at the end of April. But then, of course, I think, as you remember, that things really deteriorated, during the summer of that year. And so my real unit, the Delaware Air National Guard C-130 unit, was called back. So they asked me to go back with that unit. This was our flight medicine clinic at Al Udeid. It's still in a tent. And Julie, or Dr. Parsonette, knows the story. So I showed up at Flight Medicine Clinic and introduced myself to the young active duty major who was the commander of the unit, and he's the man on the left. And he said, "Well, Colonel, it's great to have you here. I've heard about you and everything, and we'd love to have your help. And honestly, we've got 7 flight surgeons here, so if you could just work like 1 shift a week, and then, if you wanted to go help out at the hospital, since I'm trained in hospital medicine, I'm sure they could use you there." Well, anyway, so I did. I worked my 1 shift a week. Well, about the 4th day, I was at Al Udeid. The commander of our Expeditionary Airlift Squadron, her name was at that time Lieutenant Colonel Carol Timmons, and she later became a 2-star general in the Air National Guard. Sadly, died a couple years ago, but Carol had this kind of funny Delaware accent, even funnier than my accent. And so it was about the 4th day that we're at Al Udeid, and I was over at Ops. And she comes up to me and she says, "Colonel," she says, "I hear you're not too busy in Flight Medicine Clinic." And I go, well, Carol, yeah, that's right. She said, "Wow," it says, "only 4 of my 6 crews have 2 loadmasters assigned. So I'm assigning you to fly as a loadmaster any day that you're not working in clinic." And so, okay, yes, ma'am. So anyway, what a loadmaster is, you're the enlisted air crew that flies in the back. And so one of the reasons in combat, particularly, that they like to have 2 loadmasters is because, you usually do what are called engine running onloads and offloads, meaning you never shut the engines down if you can help it in a combat zone. And because often, you are, under fire and that sort of thing. And there's also, a lot of cargo that you got to push off and then load back on. Usually it's best to have someone working the pallet locks up in the front of the aircraft, and then the second loadmaster in the back. And then, of course, then after you load the cargo, you bring the troops on. You say if you're flying troops out of there, and you got to get them strapped in and make sure they got earplugs and that sort of stuff. And then you taxi out, and you position loadmasters on the left side and the right side of the aircraft, and they're what they call tactical scanners. So your job is to basically look for surface-to-air fire, so small arms fire, rocket-propelled grenades, and we even got shot at a couple of times with SA-7, which are heat-seeking surface-to-air missiles. So that's basically what you do there. And of course, at night, you wear night vision goggles. I'm sure you've seen images of what things look like with that. So again, this is a photograph. I think this is actually 2003 in Bagram. We flew a few missions there. Most of our missions were in Iraq. And again, this is looking to the south. And these are a couple of Army Chinook helicopters flying. So Bagram, again, it's about elevation of Denver, maybe a couple hundred feet higher. So more than 5,000 feet, and it's surrounded on essentially all 4 sides by pretty high mountains, and particularly to the east and the southeast are the Hindu Kush Mountains, which are basically the foothills of the Himalayas. So you get a sense, this is in the summer, and so the peaks of these mountains are above 15,000 feet. So one of the things that being a pilot also, at the briefings, particularly if it were new air crew that were flying, one of the things I'd always emphasize is that the biggest threat in Afghanistan, at least then, was not as much probably small arms fire, but it was actually, as I call it, cumulogranite, which is running into some rocks. So again, very unforgiving terrain. And again, it's not like in the US where you've got ground-based navigational aids and that sort of thing. So this would be like a typical mission that we would fly. Again, these are US Army troops, and probably the guy with the beard and the long hair on the right, I think is a Navy SEAL. So again, a lot of special operations were used, particularly in Afghanistan, even more than Iraq. So many of the forward operating bases had airfields that we could land at, but some of them, particularly down in Helmand province, they didn't have airfields. So what we did were airdrops. So we'd actually drop cargo by parachute out the back of our C-130s. And of course, this was, a lot of work, but, very important. So again, going back a little bit to Afghanistan and the tactical situation. So we divided the country into 4 sort of areas of operational responsibility. So in the north, you've got Mazar-e Sharif, and there's a lot of actually Uzbek people that live in the northern part of Afghanistan. In the west, it was, at least both times I was there, it was relatively quiet, and Herat is the largest city there. And again, that's not too far from the Iran border. In the south, the largest city is Kandahar, where we also had a large airfield. And then in the area 4, including kind of the center of the country and the east, you've got Kabul, the capital, and then also facing Pakistan, you're actually up in some of those high mountains that sort of overlap into tribal areas of Pakistan. Again, a lot of those were sort of notorious as Taliban kind of hideouts. Switching to Iraq for a minute, Iraq is a country of 26 million people, 6.2 million in Baghdad, which again is this amazing ancient city. Has anybody here been to Iraq at all? But it's really, I just loved all of the history. Again, Baghdad is in the center, and traditionally people think of, well, the Kurds live in the north, which they do, and then you've got, traditionally you had Sunni Arabs living in the center and the western part of Iraq, and then Shia Arabs in the south. But the reality is, though, is that Iraq has been a very cosmopolitan culture, for centuries. And so the statistics are actually, at least when I was there, you had as many Kurds living in Baghdad, the center of the country, as you did in all of northern Iraq. And so, some of you, may have remembered, it was about 15 years ago now, that Joe Biden, when he was Senator Biden, came up with what he modestly called the Biden plan, which was to split Iraq into 3 pieces. And I actually went up to him when, he was speaking at a meeting in Delaware. And, I said, well, very respectfully, sir, I don't think your plan is going to work, for the reasons that I just said, that Iraq really is very much a mixed country today. So, going back to some really sad stuff. So these are images that many of you, remember. This was the images of the World Trade Center on 9/11, 2001. When, well, basically Saudi Arabian terrorists flew 2 jet airliners into the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center. The third aircraft actually hit the west wall of the Pentagon and killed about 300 people. And then the fourth aircraft, because by that time the word had gotten out, and so passengers on the fourth aircraft were aware that 2 or 3 other aircrafts had been commandeered and crashed by terrorists. So some brave people, actually young men, overcame the hijackers, and they used a beverage cart to break their way into the cockpit of the aircraft. And then, though, the terrorist who was flying the aircraft rolled the plane inverted and crashed it into the ground out near Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, killing, of course, everyone on board the aircraft. So very, very sad day. And you guys are probably a little too young to have remembered that day, but those of us who were above maybe 6 years of age in 2001 remember this day. Again, I was at that point assigned to the Delaware Air National Guard. I called my command post, shortly after, watching these images on TV. And basically, our unit had been placed on alert. So I think you guys probably remember that no commercial aircraft flew for about a week after 9/11. So about 2 days later, I drove up to Travis Air Force Base and hitched a ride on a C-5, which is this airplane here, overnight to Dover Air Force Base, and again, which is just a little bit south of where my unit is based. So by that point, again, this is about 3 days after 9/11, 4 days after 9/11. At that point, the large mortuary at Dover Air Force Base was receiving all the casualties from the Pentagon, both the people that had died on the aircraft as well as the military and civilian personnel working in the Pentagon that died that day. And the commander of the Air Force, or rather the Armed Forces Institute of Pathology, was actually in charge of the operation. So, again, doing forensic exams and identifying the human remains of the people that died that day. And, this is really etched in my mind. But what didn't make me cry, being a doctor, I'm kind of used to gruesome things. But what made me cry was this one room. It was like a big closet, maybe about as big as from that pillar here to here. And it was filled. There were 3 racks, I believe. And every rack held a Class A uniform of every single one of the military personnel that died at the Pentagon on 9/11. Again, the idea was that, most of them, were burned, but the tradition was in the military is that, after the remains were embalmed, they would place the service dress uniform on top of the remains. I just kept thinking about how if I had been to the Pentagon on September 10th, one of these young enlisted people probably would have put a report on my desk and said, "Here, Colonel, here's that report that you wanted," and saluted smartly. So again, this was that picture, of the mission in Afghanistan in 2004. And that was real interesting. And I did actually spend a fair amount of time talking with President Karzai. He's a very smart man, Western educated, has a PhD, I forget in what field, but it's very, very, very interesting. And again, this is one of the speeches that he gave out kind of in the middle of the country, dedicating the highway that runs between Kandahar and Kabul. Again, it's a picture I took of him in the CH-47 helicopter. And these are, again, our private security guards working for the State Department, and they just popped a smoke canister to, basically mark the landing zone so the Chinooks can come in and pick us up and take us to our next stop. Again, this is a photograph that I took later that same deployment with these Afghan National Army soldiers who wanted their picture taken with us. So talking a little bit about the types of wounds and injuries that we saw both in Iraq and Afghanistan. So these are the main mechanisms. So I'll explain these abbreviations. So IEDs are improvised explosive devices or homemade bombs, small arms fire. These are mostly AK-47s and other small arms. Indirect fire is the military term for basically rockets, mortars, etc. And RPGs are rocket-propelled grenades, and these are used particularly to pierce armor, armored vehicles. VBEDs are vehicle-borne IEDs, so that was a kind of a common thing, used both in Iraq and Afghanistan, where a suicide bomber would just pack a car or a truck, full of explosives, and then try to drive through the gate of a military base and then detonate the IED. The suicide vest IEDs, again, are, I think probably you've heard of those. It's where, again, a suicide bomber, is essentially strapped full of explosives. IRAMs we used a little bit in Iraq, and these were improvised rocket-assisted mortars where they would actually have like a propane tank attached to a rocket, and then they could fire it over the wall of a base. This was actually a photograph that I took in Al-Hilla, Iraq, which is the modern name for Babylon, the ancient city of, the Mesopotamian Babylonian Empire. And this was actually after I had changed command and was getting ready to leave. And the Army had asked me for weeks, because we'd been supporting them, because they didn't have a flight surgeon, to go fly with them. So I agreed to do that. And so I was actually taking a picture of kind of the ruins of Babylon when I just happened to catch an IED exploding, in the frame of the picture. So a little bit about IEDs. So this is kind of an example of a kind of what I would call a first generation, fairly small improvised explosive device. Again, typically using homemade explosives. What we started seeing, though, in late 2005 were these horrible devices called EFPs, or explosively formed penetrator type IEDs. They're also known as shaped charge IEDs. So the way these were designed is you would have like a hollow tube, typically like a 155 millimeter artillery shell, packed full of homemade explosives, and then with a copper basically plug, copper liner that would act as essentially as a projectile With a traditional IED, essentially the energy of the explosion goes in all directions, whereas with an EFP, all the energy is in one direction. So what you have is essentially this molten copper slug that's traveling at about 4,000 feet per second. And so these devices were so powerful that they would not only penetrate, lightly armored vehicles like Humvees, but if it hit it right, could even penetrate the armor of an Abrams tank, if you've ever seen one of those. So the types of, injuries that I saw, and sadly most of them were fatal, were just horrific. Again, fast forward to 2019, and I think many of you know, and this is a small group, but I was not a big fan of a lot of what President Donald Trump did. One of the only things that he did that I kind of approved of really was when he ordered the killing of Qasem Soleimani. And Soleimani was an Iranian general who was the head of the Quds Force. And so they were actually the source of almost all of these EFPs that were killing our soldiers in Iraq. And at one point, I think more than 70% of our combat casualties, particularly combat deaths, were due to these Iranian technology EFPs. IEDs are triggered various ways. So the simplest way is what's called a command wire, where basically you've got a wire running to the device and just a simple switch that you press that detonates the IED. The problem with that, of course, is that the wire would have to be very, very long if you want to get away after you detonate it. So other things that the terrorists came up with, particularly, let's say, if you want to place a bomb in a crowded market and kill a bunch of innocent people, you do what's called a fixed delay timer. The most common mechanism for that is actually a Casio watch, a $15 watch that was used as the triggering mechanism there. Break wire triggers. This is the way if you're going to say booby trap a house. So that these were encountered a lot as well. Pressure plates. This is where basically a small plate is buried, usually under just an inch or two of dirt. And when a dismounted soldier, a dismounted patrol, steps on over the pressure plate, it closes the switch and again detonates the IED. So this is mostly what was killing our soldiers in Afghanistan, were these pressure plate triggered IEDs. Radio controlled firing system. This is basically where you would attach a cell phone to the device, and then you'd have someone else call the cell phone, and then it would explode it. We actually figured that they were doing that back in 2003, 2004. And so we actually fitted all of our tactical vehicles with radio frequency jammers. So the idea is that the jammer would actually trigger the IED before the vehicle actually got there, within the lethal range of the IED. Light trigger, dark trigger, that's a Radio Shack kind of a sensor that you can get. And then what was generally the type of triggering mechanism that was paired with these Iranian EFPs were passive IR detectors, passive infrared detectors. And so this is, again, what these would look like. One of the things that did save a lot of lives, at least from IEDs that were planted, in the road, were these MRAPs. That's the vehicle in front, and that stands for Mine Resistant Ambush Protected Vehicle. And it's got a V-shaped hull that would actually help diffuse the blast energy of an explosion if it's buried in the road. And then the second vehicle there, that's an up-armored Humvee, which were pretty ubiquitous. So again, this is a vehicle that's actually been hit by, I believe, a rocket-propelled grenade. This is a fairly lightly armored Stryker vehicle. And one of the things also that was done a lot in Iraq was fairly complex IED attacks. And so what, say, the terrorists would do is they would disable a bus on a busy highway like this. I think is probably what we call Route Irish, which is the main east-west highway cutting across Baghdad. So they would disable a bus in the highway, and then our convoy would come, and then it would get stopped by the disabled bus, and then the terrorists would detonate a series of daisy-chained IEDs to actually then, basically attack the convoy. And then sometimes, of course, after the soldiers jumped out, then they would have a complex attack, followed up with small arms fire. So these were, again, something that we were very aware of, but were fairly hard to defend against at times. This is actually a photograph taken probably in 2003, shortly after the invasion. And these are bullet holes from small arms fire in an unarmored, or what we call a soft Humvee, which was 90% of the vehicles that we sent over during the initial invasion did not have any armor at all. I remember riding in Nasiriyah to visit a children's hospital in 2003, and I just had this little flimsy canvas door, so no armor at all on these. But we did finally, I think, retroactively up-armored just about all of our Humvees, and so that's what they looked like. So they again are not able, let's say, to tolerate blast energy of an EFP, but they certainly though could withstand smaller IEDs. And then of course the people inside the main cabin of the vehicle are protected from small arms fire. However, the gunner is pretty exposed. So up in that kind of Pope Mobile-like cupola up at the top, that's where the gunner is. And so his shoulders are fairly well protected by the bulletproof glass around him, but his head is kind of at the level or even slightly above that cupola. And then you've got a Kevlar helmet that also gives you fairly good protection. And then you've got a strike plate made out of very heavy ceramic, both in front and back. But the problem is that your neck is really not protected at all. So one of the things that the terrorists learned to do pretty quickly was to actually target the head and neck of the gunner, particularly in places like Sadr City, where you're fighting in an urban environment. So you'd have a sniper, on the roof or maybe in the third floor of one of these fairly tall buildings, often armed with a Markov high-power sniper rifle, and then they would target the neck of the soldier. And again, I remember, very clearly when I was in Iraq in 2008, called to the morgue in the middle of the night. And this was again during the surge where there was very heavy fighting a lot of places in Iraq, but particularly in Sadr City and up in Diyala province up in the northeast. And again, with the Army Mortuary Affairs people, I unzipped the body bag, and it was a young U.S. Army captain who had noticed, had actually died at the Combat Support Hospital on the other side of Baghdad, run by the Army, and noticed, he had a surgical incision, and there was an entrance wound in his neck and an exit wound kind of out the left side of his chest. And what had happened was that the bullet had transected his aorta, so he literally probably bled to death, within a few minutes. The operative report, though, had been dictated and was already actually with his body. And I still remember the surgeon, describing, the fact that he had actually apparently had pulses when they threw him in a helicopter in Sadr City. It was only like a 5-minute helicopter flight to the Combat Support Hospital in the Green Zone, but he had become pulseless by the time he got into the trauma bay at the cache. And they opened his chest, in the emergency room. The surgeon cross-clamped his aorta. They pumped blood directly into the right side of his heart, but could not save him. And I still remember the surgeon in his operative report said, "It was an honor caring for this brave young man." And, I'd never seen that in an operative report at Stanford. These are rocket-propelled grenades. Again, this is another Stryker vehicle. It's been hit by RPGs. We also, again, we didn't have enough troops really to secure all of the weapons from Saddam's army that he had stored. So there were tons of these 81mm rockets that the bad guys had commandeered when the Iraqi government fell in 2003. So our base got targeted fairly regularly by these, but fortunately, they don't have a real big warhead, and they often weren't fused accurately. So we didn't have any fatalities from these rockets, but we did have a couple of C-17s that were damaged pretty heavily on the ramp, but these generally nighttime attacks. In contrast, this is a 107mm Chinese-made rocket. And this is what was mostly shot at us on our bases in Afghanistan. This, in contrast, though, has like a 20-pound warhead. So this really can do some serious damage. And again, I remember in 2011, again, one nighttime attack, one of these rockets came through the roof of one of the B huts and exploded and killed an airman in the middle of the night. And this is actually a photograph that I took also in 2011. And I'd just come back from flying a combat mission and was getting ready to turn my survival radio in to life support. And again, I heard the whistle with the incoming rocket. And I was like so tired. I'd been up for almost 20 hours at that point. I hear the explosion, and then you hear the shrapnel hit the metal hangar. It was just 100 yards away. So of course, immediately jumped down, into a ditch, and until the all clear came, over the giant voice. So then I ran out to the flight line to check and make sure, nobody was hurt, and render first aid if somebody was hurt. Fortunately, nobody was hurt, but the rocket had actually landed right next to, on the left side of one of our C-130s, and exploded. And there was some shrapnel, in the side of the aircraft. But then, I smelled jet fuel. So I walked all around the airplane. In the opposite side of the aircraft, there was this is what the external fuel tank. So this is almost like life size. That's a big piece of shrapnel from this 107 that had actually scooted across the ramp and then hit the chocks and then bounced up like a pool shot and then hit the fuel tank, and it was draining fuel. But again, it's not super flammable, so the aircraft didn't burst into flame. These are SA-7s. These are Soviet-made or Russian-made now, heat-seeking shoulder-fired missiles. And see, once in Iraq and then once in Afghanistan in 2011, the aircraft I was flying on was targeted with these. They definitely get your attention at night, because what you actually see on your night vision goggles when you're, again, the tactical scanner, is that you see a flash and then this kind of corkscrew coming up at you. And so that's kind of a key that, it's a surface-to-air missile that you're being hit with. So again, we had this IR countermeasures, basically flares, that we could either dispense manually, or we'd have a system that would spit the flares out if it was able to detect the launch automatically. So again, both times that my C-130 was targeted, the system worked as advertised, and we did fine. So again, this is kind of just a typical mission. Like say, once you're up at altitude, I could get out of my paratroop door and come up and hang out with the pilots up front. This is another mission that we flew in 2011. This was an airdrop mission out in Helmand province. That's actually the Helmand River. So this is kind of west of Kandahar. So the way you'd fly these missions, again, because a jet or a turboprop aircraft burns a lot less fuel, higher altitude. So we would come in, say at 20,000 feet, and then maybe 15, 20 miles out, we would descend down to 1,500 feet to do the paradrop, dropping the cargo, the supplies, for the Marines that needed them. So this is actually, we were just dropped down to, I think we're here probably maybe 2,000 feet. So we're still descending. And then at that point, we're listening to the tactical frequency on the radio. And I think our call sign that day was Growler 4-1, so you hear Growler 4-1, break, break. That means everybody else on frequency shut up. And it basically says, I need you to, basically hold 10 miles west of the IP. The IP is the initial point. He said, we've identified a threat. So anyway, so we climbed back up a little higher and then, did as directed, so we turned around and headed back to the, actually east of the IP. And so anyway, then they switched us to another frequency. And it turned out what had happened was they detected the bad guys had got this old ZSU-23 anti-aircraft artillery gun. And it was set up actually right at our IP. So we definitely would not have done well if they targeted us. But again, we're holding now like 10 miles to the east at this point. And we listen on frequency as the controllers call in this is a Reaper drone armed with 2 Hellfire missiles. And so, we're listening on frequency as the drone is, cleared to shoot. So he fires the 2 Hellfire missiles, and they both miss wildly. And then the guys, the bad guys, they of course haul ass. And then a couple minutes later, they call in an F-18 Hornet, have to be a Marine F-18 Hornet, and he drops a single 500-pound bomb and destroys the gun. And then like a minute later, they come over our tactical frequency and clear us in to do our airdrop. So, a little bit of a nail-biting mission. But when we got back to Bagram, of course, we debrief every mission with intel, the intelligence officers. And I remember, telling them that, well, it was actually not a bad day, because we didn't get shot down. They destroyed the gun, and we were able to do our airdrop. And even the bad guys got to live another day. So everybody worked out fine for everyone that day. So let's talk a little bit about combat injuries. So are any of you here biology majors or pre-med or interested in medicine at all? All right. Well, some of the pictures I'm going to show you might be a little bit gruesome, but I think you can take it. But one of the things that we really did well as a medical corps in in our wars in Iraq and Afghanistan was markedly reduce the rate of death from combat injuries. So if you go back to the American Civil War, that 1/3 of soldiers who were wounded in combat died of their wounds. Whereas, the Vietnam War, the mortality rate with surgical advances and helicopter medevac was cut to about 24%. But during our wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, the mortality rate was less than 10%. And there's a lot of reasons for it. But one of them was that, we really figured out this very disciplined approach to combat care where you've got, initial care actually right on the battlefield by the soldiers' buddies in a battalion aid station, usually within just a few minutes away. Forward surgical teams are usually only maybe at the most 15 minutes away by helicopter from wherever you were fighting. And then we had a series of level 3 combat support hospitals, which are really like, pretty high powered, almost like teaching hospitals in the US with, basically level 1 trauma centers. So we had these in Afghanistan, both in Kandahar and at Bagram Airfield north of Kabul. And in Iraq, our big level 3 hospital was at Balad, which was about 50 miles north of Baghdad. And then usually after initial surgery at the FAST team, or if it went initially to a combat support hospital, they would only spend a day or two there. And then they would be medevac to Landstuhl, Germany, where they would undergo additional surgery. And then usually after another day or two at Landstuhl, they would end up being medevaced either to San Antonio or Washington, D.C., to our big military hospitals there. So this is an article in the New England Journal, showing, again, just one soldier's actually journey from being wounded on the battlefield to going through the military healthcare system. And that lower slide on the right is actually essentially a mobile ICU that we would set up in C-17s, let's say for a longer flight, because say from Afghanistan to Germany, I think it's about, remember correctly, about a 5 or 6 hour flight. So you really needed to, very critically injured soldier or Marine, you would have to have essentially the setup to keep them alive during that time. Again, helicopter medevac, as in Vietnam, was really a huge factor in getting people, to an operating room, within that what we call the golden hour after initial trauma. These are some of my medics in 2006 during my 3rd deployment, taking a wounded soldier off of a medevac helicopter to bring him into our trauma bay at Baghdad. This is again what a trauma code or would look like, or a mass casualty, where say a convoy, would be hit with a complex attack, and you'd end up with maybe half a dozen or more, injured or wounded soldiers. So again, it was kind of an all-hands effort. We only had 2 surgeons, a general surgeon, an orthopedic surgeon, an anesthesiologist, and myself, and another emergency room doctor, an internist, and a psychiatrist who actually was pretty handy, as well as a number of nurses and enlisted medical techs. So when you would have one of these mass casualties, it was really all hands on deck, and even clerical personnel would come and help out in terms of getting supplies from the back if needed. Of course, you'd run a trauma checklist to keep track of what you've done, to the patient, that sort of thing. We used a lot of ultrasound at the bedside. So this is actually an ultrasound showing some blood in the pericardium. That's the sac surrounding the heart. This was actually an Iraqi soldier who was shot through the abdomen. He was very lucky. The bullet missed all vital structures. So we took him to the operating room and it had done no damage. So he actually went home that night to his family with an incision about this big. So he was a lucky guy. Again, this is me helping out in the OR. I think it's possibly that same patient. Again, typically we would, with abdominal wounds that we wouldn't close the skin up. We'd leave them open and leave the wound packed and put a wound vac on them, and then they would do a washout when they got to Germany, and then again usually at Walter Reed. So this is a kind of a gruesome picture, but one of the terrible things were these horrible improvised explosive devices. And so the thing is that we reduced the mortality. This would have been a fatal injury 100% of the time in Vietnam, but because every soldier had a combat application tourniquet, or CAT tourniquet we called them, that they were taught to apply to either themselves or to a buddy, that we could actually prevent death from exsanguination or bleeding out in a large percentage of these cases. So again, this is what one of these CATs looks like. So get another IED injury. One of the things, though, that impressed me so much, and during my next to the last assignment in the Air National Guard before I retired, was I was assigned to the big military hospital at Brooke Army Medical Center in San Antonio. And so I got to see, while many of these soldiers are undergoing rehab, and just what amazed me was just what a positive attitude that they all had. They didn't really feel sorry for themselves, although I think that would have been a normal human reaction. This was actually a photograph I took of a soldier at his request. This was in, again, Bagram at a Craig Joint Theater Hospital in 2011. And he was part of a QRF, a quick reaction force that had responded to a U.S. Army gunship that had been shot down a few hours before, only about 40 miles east of our base. And again, they basically, when they arrived, the Taliban was already surrounding the wreckage. And so it was a pretty vicious firefight. And this soldier, unfortunately, took probably an AK-47 round through his left upper arm, fracturing his arm. So he has what's called an external fixator device after he came out of the operating room. But we actually presented him with a Purple Heart right after he got out of the recovery room. So, and he wanted us to take a picture and email it to him and his family. This is a little more technical, but these are again more IED injuries. And this was I'll tell you a little bit about this case. So this is again someone in the operating room who's was actually a terrorist. This was an Al-Qaeda terrorist that had actually shot down a U.S. Army helicopter about 4 days before. And anyway, he had made this video and posted it on an Islamist website, showing him and his buddies dragging the American pilots' bodies out of the aircraft and then stabbing them with a bayonet. And I think even his friends that saw this on TV or on the video, the computer, thought it was a little over the top. And so someone turned him in to the Coalition Forces hotline. And so about 5 days later, U.S. Navy SEAL, who's embedded with Iraqi Special Forces soldiers, they find the guy, and there's a big firefight. And at one point, they think the firefight's over, but the main bad guy comes around the corner, and the SEAL sees him out of the corner of his eye and draws his 9mm and shoots him, and it hits him in the groin and severs his femoral artery. And it was just amazing. The SEAL who brought this guy, to our combat hospital for care, described, how this happened. And he, tells me how after he shot him, if he takes a second just to kind of calm down, then he runs over to this guy who had killed 2 American helicopter pilots a few days before, and he jams a roll of Curlex into the wound, applies a tourniquet, and then the SEAL starts an IV. And by the time he got to our facility, had given him 2 liters of normal saline, of IV fluids. So, when people like get down on America, I tell that story that we're good people, and we even save the lives of bad guys. And uh, anyway, the SEAL, you can send that little paper around, but he was actually trained as a medic as well as a special forces soldier. And he asked me, he said, hey doc, would you, he kind of wanted advice and wanted me to teach him about what he could have done differently in this case. Another thing too, and I don't want to get too political, but one of the things that does bother me is when people who've never served in the military, or particularly never served in combat, they like to talk tough. And General Mattis, who I actually call a friend, who was served as Secretary of Defense for almost 2 years during the Trump administration, talked about how when he was being interviewed by Trump before his inauguration to serve as Secretary of Defense, Trump asked General Mattis, he said, well, what do you think? He says, I think when we get bad guys, we should torture them. Don't you agree, General Mattis? Mattis, of course, has this reputation as being a tough guy. But apparently Mattis, without hesitation, said to Trump, no, he goes, we don't torture people. Says, you get a lot more information if you give somebody a beer and a cigarette, then interrogate them. And so anyway, so people like General Eisenhower, who was president when I was a little boy, they understood this. But, again, when you hear people like Trump saying, I'm going to bomb the shit out of people and I'll blow up, I'll kill their families. And you've got Ted Cruz saying, we'll carpet bomb, the Middle East and, and all that. It's like people in the military don't talk that way. And I was really proud of the fact that in the lead up to the 2016 election, that's General Dunford, the Marine on the left with President Obama, and the man on the right is General Paul Selva, who's an Air Force officer. And Selva actually, after this one debate where Trump and Cruz are, saying they're going to kill innocent people, to kill terrorists, and Paul Selva, without naming either of them, he put out a release. He said, I just want to remind the American public that the United States Air Force does not commit war crimes. And so be proud of your military, because we're standing up for the right things. And again, that's Jim Mattis, who many of you know, who's here at the Hoover. So I'm going to kind of skip through this, but one of the reasons that Jim Mattis quit, resigned from the Trump administration just before Christmas in 2019, was when Trump, after getting off the phone with Erdogan of Turkey, who's this horrible autocratic leader of Turkey, basically Trump told Mattis, without even talking to the Joint Chiefs of Staff or with him, said, well, we're going to pull all of our troops out of Afghanistan, and we're going to pull all of our troops out of Syria and northern Iraq. And of course, we were still in the middle of the fight with ISIS at that point. So, I wrote this op-ed that actually Dr. Parsonet helped me with. So anyway, just switching up. You guys aren't medical people, but this is we didn't see all combat injuries. This was actually an eye injury in a firefighter. This is a disease called leishmaniasis, a parasitic disease that you see in particularly southern Iraq. And this is a tuberculosis in an Afghan detainee. So when I was at Bagram in 2011, we had a large number of detainees at the detention facility in Parwan, and there's fairly high prevalence of tuberculosis in Afghanistan. So I helped the Army establish protocols for screening and treatment of TB while I was there. This is actually a disease called Q fever, which is, again, a bacterial infection that we don't see very often in the US, but I saw a lot of it in Iraq. And this is a blood smear of a patient with malaria. This was, again, a detainee at Camp Cropper, which was the large detention facility in Baghdad. And this is a kind of a rare parasitic disease called schistosomiasis. Diagnosis was made by a 19-year-old US Army lab technician. I was so proud of her, because I think probably even most infectious disease specialists might not have made the diagnosis, but this 19-year-old enlisted woman did. So we actually wrote up the article, and I insisted that she be the first author on the paper. And then one of the other things that kind of was very sad about Iraq, particularly, was when the country fell into chaos in 2003, that half the doctors left the country. And so particularly, specialists like spine surgeons or open heart surgeons or neurosurgeons, all fled and they went to Europe or the United States. And so we ran a little clinic just outside the wire of our base. It was run by Army Civil Affairs, and all of us doctors just about that, had time, we would staff the clinic and saw a lot of children. This is a little boy named Ali who had a severe scoliosis that we were able to bring over for surgery in Philadelphia at Shriners Hospital. And this is another girl. She was a teenager at the time, and we brought her also to Philadelphia for spine surgery, and I think that was in 2006. And somehow her dad found out that I was back in Iraq in 2008, and so we got permission to bring her and her dad on base, just to say hi, have a cup of tea. These are a couple of little boys with congenital heart disease that couldn't get surgery in Iraq that I brought over to Wilmington, Delaware, to the Nemours Children's Hospital for surgery. And there were no burn centers in Iraq, so this is a little baby who'd been accidentally burned when a heater blew up. And we were able to get her sent to the Shriners Burn Hospital in Boston. And that's me taking her up the stairs to the contract aircraft that flew her to Kuwait. And then she went commercial on United to Boston. And this is kind of a sad, very sad case. This is a young Iraqi woman. She was like 21 years old and had a 2-year-old baby at home, a toddler. And her husband poured gasoline on her and lit her on fire. And she was literally dying, at a civilian hospital in Baghdad when her uncle, who was actually training as an air traffic controller, found out that I had some connections, back in the States. And so he sent me these photographs of her actually before this is. And so I was able to get permission from the US Army, who I knew had one of the best burn surgeons from San Antonio deployed there at the time. And in theory, we were not supposed to take care of Iraqis or Afghans at our military hospitals unless we were responsible for the damage. But we broke that rule all the time, because we had enough excess capacity. So anyway, the commander of the Combat Support Hospital, who's a helicopter pilot, he and I'd become buddies, and I explained the situation. He goes, "Yeah, no problem." He says, "Get her over here, and I'll make sure that we let her in the gate and everything." So they operated on her at the Combat Support Hospital every day for 30 days till we could get her in good enough shape. And we flew her to Boston as well on United Airlines. These are, again, some of the amazing young and middle-aged Iraqi women, who worked at our Civil Military Operations Center clinic. The lady in the middle is a Iraqi doctor who actually had emigrated to the US in the 80s, but she came back to work with the coalition forces. And then the 4 women on either side of her are actually Iraqi school teachers that were there helping out. And of course, we were behind, wire, every day and relatively safe. But the Iraqis who worked with the coalition forces, they had to go home every night to their neighborhoods. So they were often targeted, with death threats and things like that. So, this mentioned to you that, we couldn't save all of the soldiers and airmen and sailors that were wounded and or killed in combat. So part of my job was to go to the morgue every night and pronounce death in the people who died in combat during the day. So, again, I know this is kind of said, if anybody here like familiar with the story of Job in the Bible? Do you remember that story? Yeah, a little bit. So anyway, so it's in one of the books of the Old Testament. So just a little bit of history. So Job was apparently he was a very good man. He was a successful farmer, like 2,000 years, BC. And the kind of the Old Testament, there's parts of it that are very dark, in my opinion. And Job is like, to me, one of the most frightening stories in the Bible. And the basic plot is that Job is this really good man who loves God. And God and the devil essentially, have like a bet that, well, and the devil says, well, I'll bet if we take away all of the wonderful things that you've given him, that he won't love you anymore, and he'll reject you. And God says, okay, bet's on. So the first thing they do is they burn down his orchards. And then the second thing they do is they kill all of his cattle. And then the third thing, I think, is they kill his children. And at one point, like Job cries out, in pain to God. He says, well, why are you doing this to me? And then God answers in this very way that I don't find comforting at all. He says back to Job, he says, well, have you the gates of death been revealed to you? Have you seen the gates of darkness? Have you comprehended the expanse of the earth? Declare if you know this. So basically, God is telling this mortal, well, you don't know why I do things. So like, don't even question it. Anyway, I kind of thought of that verse a lot, when I was particularly in Iraq. And these are the mortuary affairs soldiers who came to my change of command ceremony in September of 2008 and presented me with this flag. And this flag is the same flag that would be put on the transfer case. So that flag that I have in my den, my apartment, means more to me than all the decorations that I got in my career. It's not all bad though. So one of the most fun parts was, as I mentioned, I'm a pilot, as well as a doctor, flight surgeon. And so when we came home from Afghanistan, we got to fly our own aircraft over. So we took off, and this was, let's see, probably late June, early July of 2011, late June 2011. And we took off at like 5 in the morning, it really wasn't even light yet. And C-130s don't fly real fast, I think, so we had to stop in Tbilisi, Georgia, the former Soviet Republic, for fuel. And when we landed, Chris is the guy just to the left of me on that picture. It's the aircraft commander. He comes over the PA system, the intercom, and he goes, okay, crew, it was time to get out of your flight suits, change into your blue jeans. And so we all did. And of course, it's like completely against the rules to fly a military aircraft wearing blue jeans. You're supposed to wear your Nomex flight suit. But we all joked that one of the younger enlisted guys said, Colonel, says, can we get in trouble for that? And I go, what are they going to do? Give us short haircuts and send us to Afghanistan? So anyway, that's my answer when I do something that's against the rules. So anyway, that's a picture in the C-130 cockpit where we're probably somewhere out over the middle of the ocean. And then these are actually my staff or senior staff when I was commander of the combat hospital in Baghdad. And I still keep in touch with a lot of these folks, really, really good people. And that was my little boy, Sammy, who was just 3 years old, no, 2 years old when 9/11 happened. And of course, I was gone a lot, while he was a little boy. But anyway, he's grown up. He just graduated from NYU last year. So he grew up a lot. And that's in Glacier Park, Montana, which I encourage you to go visit before the glaciers are all gone with global warming. And so again, going back though to, I've always thought about, well, what would I do? I don't think God of Abraham's ever going to talk to me, but if he ever asked me this, I did come up with an answer. And it kind of came to me during one of the last missions I flew in Afghanistan, and a rain shower had just come across the field. And I took this picture looking kind of toward the east, this beautiful rainbow. And so I was kind of thinking that, this is what I'll say back to God. I have witnessed the depths of darkness, and I've stood on every continent of the earth, including the glaciers of Antarctica, which Julie went to with me. I've flown a jet fighter faster than the speed of sound. I've flown so high that the glass above my canopy is dark during the day. And anyway, this is what I tell our medical students, who I want to be healers, not just technicians taking care of sick people, that in the midst of darkness is light, and light is love, and it's the most powerful force in the universe, and it's more powerful than fear and hate. And this light is really what's inside of us. And go forth and spread this light. So I am going to stop. Thank you.